I never believed in curses. Growing up, I'd hear stories about haunted houses and restless spirits, but I always chalked it up to overactive imaginations and old, dying superstitions. That was before Blackthorn Manor came into my life.
When my grandmother passed away and left me the house, I knew I couldn't let it go. The house had been in my family for generations, and even though it had been abandoned for years, there was something about it that called to me. The village of Blackthorn Hollow, where the manor sat, was small, quiet, and isolated from the rest of the world. The perfect place for a fresh start. As I pulled into the long, winding driveway leading up to the manor, I couldn't help but feel a strange weight in my chest. Blackthorn Manor stood before me, towering over the surrounding forest, its ancient stones weathered by time and neglect. The roof sagged slightly, and the windows, what little were intact, looked like eyes staring down at me, cold and unblinking. The house wasn't just old, it was worn, as though it had lived through something long, dark, and forgotten. I stepped out of my car and made my way up to the front door, a chill sweeping through the air despite the warmth of the afternoon. The wooden door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. The interior was exactly what I expected. Dusty, worn, and frozen in time. Cobwebs clung to every corner, and the smell of mildew hung thick in the air. The place was a mess, but it was mine now. I walked through the front hall, the floorboards creaking beneath my boots. I ran my hand over the faded wallpaper that lined the walls, its once vibrant patterns now muted by years of neglect. My grandmother's presence seemed to linger in every room, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the house had been waiting for me. I set my bags down in the foyer and sighed. It was time to settle in. That night, after unpacking and getting the place in some semblance of order, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was silent. The only sound, the occasional groan of the floorboards or the wind rattling the windows. I should have been tired, but I couldn't sleep. Something in the air made me uneasy, as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. The whispers began around midnight. At first, I thought it was just the wind, rustling through the cracks in the house. But as the minutes passed, the sound grew clearer. A soft murmur coming from the hallway outside my room. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The voice seemed to call my name, softly, just barely audible. Alice. I froze. My grandmother had always told me the house was special, that it had a kind of power, but she never went into detail. I assumed it was just her way of adding mystery to the place, but now, hearing that voice, I felt something stir deep inside me. It was as though the house itself was speaking, beckoning me to listen. I pushed the blankets off and slowly stood up, my feet cold against the wooden floor. I crept to the door and opened it, half expecting to find nothing but empty shadowed hallways, but the air was different. It felt thick, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. I stepped into the hallway, my bare feet making soft thuds against the old wood. The house seemed to breathe around me, each creak and groan adding to the growing tension in the air. I felt drawn to the staircase at the end of the hall, the one that led up to the third floor. It was an area of the house I hadn't yet explored, and my grandmother had always kept it locked. But now, the door at the top of the stairs was open. The whispers grew louder as I walked toward the stairs. "Alice, come upstairs." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. I found myself walking toward the stairs before I could even think about it. My legs moved on their own, each step carrying me upward, my heart thudding in my chest. I found myself walking toward the stairs before I could even think about it. Somewhat. I couldn't quite understand. And then somewhat. I couldn't back down. I heard screams followed me. I heard the screams fade out. The door at the end of the hall, the one I knew had been locked for years, was wide open now. My hand reached for the doorknob before I could stop it. The moment my fingers made contact, a cold, almost painful chill shot through my body. But I forced myself to push the door open. Inside, the room was dark. The windows were boarded up, and only a sliver of moonlight filtered through the cracks. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw something that made my stomach lurch. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols, scratches, and ancient runes I didn't recognize. The floor was scattered with old books, their pages yellowed with age. But it wasn't the room itself that made my heart race. It was the figure standing in the corner, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall, too tall. Its limbs seemed too long, its body unnaturally thin. I could feel its eyes on me, though I couldn't see them. The air around it was thick with darkness, as though it was absorbing the light in the room. The voice came again, but this time, it wasn't in my head. It was real, coming from the figure itself. I could feel its presence pressing in on me, and every instinct screamed for me to run. But I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the floor, my body frozen in place. The figure slowly stepped toward me, its movements jerky, as though it was struggling to maintain its form. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It reached out a long, twisted hand, and I felt a cold, sharp pain in my chest as it touched me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The room was empty again, save for the symbols on the walls and the faint whispering that filled the air. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, and slammed the door shut. The whispers didn't stop, but they had changed. They were no longer calling me upstairs. They were warning me. The house knew me now, and it wasn't letting me leave. The next few days were a blur. The whispers never stopped. They followed me everywhere, growing louder and more insistent with each passing hour. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think. I was trapped in a nightmare, my every waking moment filled with the echoes of whatever thing had been in that room. I spent hours digging through my grandmother's old journals, trying to understand what I was dealing with. It didn't take long before I found something that made my blood run cold. The house wasn't just haunted, it was cursed. The whispers were the spirits of my ancestors, trapped in the house by a dark ritual, one that had bound them to the land and to the manor itself. And they were waiting for me to fulfill my part in the ritual, to release them from their torments. But at what cost? I had to make a choice. Stay and succumb to the house's power, or leave, and risk never escaping the curse that clung to my family. I stood in front of the locked door on the 3rd floor one last time. The whispers were louder than ever, but I knew now that there was no escape. Whatever it was that had been waiting for me, it was no longer in the shadows. It was in me. The door creaked open, and the whispers finally fell silent.